Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second session of Ontario Sheep Farmers Fall Speakers Series. A special shout out to all of our Ontario Sheep sponsors who you see on the screen. Without their support, events like this would be certainly hard to pull off. With me today with Ontario Sheep is Anita O'Brien and myself, Tom Lewis. And we just have a few housekeeping announcements to make. We've allocated roughly an hour for today's presentation. We will be taking questions at the end. Both Anita and myself will do our best to try and monitor the questions box in the lower part of your control panel. So feel free at any point to type questions in, and we will try to answer those at the end of the session. So I'm just going to do a quick screen share switch over to our panelist, Lesley Stubbings, who's going to be joining us today and speaking about pushing performance and profits from a UK experience. So if everyone just gives me one moment to do control share over to Lesley. Perfect, and we see your screen now, Lesley.
Yep, okay, I've put my webcam on just for now.
Perfect, and if you can give us a little bit of a background about yourself before starting the presentation, and then I know you have some polls.
I was going to say good evening, everybody. It's evening in England, but it's lunchtime for you, so thanks for giving over your lunchtime to join us for this webinar. I'm Lesley Stubbings, and I'm an independent sheep consultant in the UK. I've been doing that for over 40 years now, which is a bit scary. And I still spend a lot of my time actually working with individual farmers. So I noticed from my introduction, I ought to really sort of, whether it's not let you down or not, but I'm not actually a vet. I am actually a husbandry, nutrition, reproductive physiology type person. And it always fascinates me when I get information about what you do in Canada, because the STAR system and accelerated lambing, I did my thesis on reproductive physiology and that sort of thing many years ago now. So I'm really interested, and hopefully you'll give me a bit of feedback later on. These days, I do a lot of work on sustainable control of parasites in sheep. So if you've got questions, we might just touch on that. But equally, I am very, very interested, because of the work that I do in individual farms, looking for how we can improve performance with profit as the main driver, and also make it robust. So that's what I'm going to try and do for this evening. Thanks, Tom.
Perfect. And I'll bring up the first polling question at this point.
Okay, so have we got those, Tom?
Yep.
Yep, okay. So do you want me to introduce these? Because I think there's just a couple of questions, and it was really just to sort of, for me to get a feel and for us to maybe have a look at the end and see if you might have changed your minds a little bit or whatever, just to focus what we're going to talk about. So the first one is, I just wanted you to choose two things from that list, one or two, it doesn't really matter, but that you would most like to improve. What at the moment, if you could choose one or two of those, which of them would you like to choose?
Okay, and we've still got some collecting of responses going on right now.
Okay.
I'll give that another. It's showing 70% have voted.
Good.
And we're almost there, 81%, so we'll give it another few seconds.
Yep. I promise it's not a trick question.
And I'm just going to close the poll. So I'm just sharing the results right now.
Right, excellent. Okay, so coming out top there is number of lambs reared per ewe. Excellent. sorry, profit margin is coming out best, that's even better, then number of lambs per ewe and higher growth rates and better conception rates somewhere in between. So that's brilliant, actually. And lower input costs, that's really interesting that no one's putting that. That's heartening, that really is. Okay, right, so can we move on to the second one? There's just two.
Okay, that should be showing up on the screen now.
Okay, so now I would just like you to choose one of these that you think would be the area that might actually bring about the improvement that you want. So just choose one that you think is the most important as far as achieving your targets.
And we're at 35% who have voted.
Okay.
%60%, so we'll give it about 30 seconds before closing the polls. Okay, and I'm going to share the results on the screen now.
Excellent. Right, okay, so I'm pleased to see management information and data use is top. Interesting, marketing and carcass specification, nothing there. Interesting, Tom and Anita. And nutrition and genetics are pretty well neck and neck. Okay, that's brilliant. Right, well, I'm preaching to the converted a little bit in terms of management information, but what I want to try and do now is we'll go into the presentation. As I'm going to say a little bit about, obviously it's what we're doing in the UK, so I'm going to say a little bit about where the UK industry is at the moment, because clearly those of you who follow what's going on in the UK with Brexit and so on will realise that sitting on the edge of a cliff is probably being a bit of an understatement. And then I'll work it through into how I think our industry needs to tackle this, and all the way through to how I think we can use some really robust information to make quite a big difference to our flocks. So a little bit of background to start with in terms of where the UK industry actually is. So in terms of its size, we're sitting at around about 16 million ewes, so it is quite a big industry. It's the biggest in Europe, and worldwide it sits as fairly well at the table in terms of the size of country flocks on a world stage. But it's been up and down quite a bit, and I'll come back to this in a minute. But you can see in 1990 we hit 20 million, and really the big changes here are to do with factors outside of the industry rather than from within the industry, and I'll mention a little bit later on. But subsidies and support has been something which has been a major feature of the UK industry for as long as I can remember in my career, and maybe, just maybe, it's probably likely that that's about to come to an end. So in terms of that, it's also worth, I think, saying that the industry is also doesn't sit on its own. The fortunes, particularly of our arable farmers, is inextricably linked with what happens with sheep. So if they are given a lot more support, and they will turn land over to growing arable crops, and the sheep will get pushed off, and we will get pushed onto permanent low value land. So there are other factors going on there which are really important and which impinge on the UK industry dramatically. Now, in terms of our balance, this is where it's really important and where our pressures are really coming from. We produce around about 300,000 tonnes of sheep meat a year, and surprisingly enough, we actually consume about 300,000 tonnes a year, which on the face of it, and I know when I'm talking to students, everyone thinks, oh, well, that's great, perfect balance. But of course, it ain't quite that easy, because we have a seasonal production system. The sheep is obviously a seasonal breeder, and particularly in the UK, and as I said in my introduction, I think quite a few of your flocks, you do buck that trend and lamb them 3 times in 2 years. So we import between 90 and 100,000 tonnes a year, and we export about 100,000 tonnes a year. And again, that looks stupid, but it's because of seasonality. It's because when we have a lot of lamb on the market, we export mainly to France, and in the winter now, our supplies are starting to dry up a bit, and then traditionally we've imported from New Zealand. So the how's that is the seasonality of production. Now, what that means is that we are incredibly reliant on exporting about 30% of our production in a certain window in the year to Europe, and in particular France. And at the moment we sit 6 weeks away from a total Brexit, our exit from the EU, and as we sit here tonight, there is no deal. If we go out without a deal at the end of December, we will go on to WTO and we will get hit with a 40 to 50% tariff. So it is really concentrating the minds. Many people are sitting like ostriches with their heads under their armpits, but for the rest of us, we have to get on with it, and it's the challenge that's being posed to us. And the sensitivity to make a big difference to our market price is only about 2,000 tonnes either way. So on top of that, of course, the exchange rate between the pound and the euro can also swing it around. So we hope we're going to get a deal, and we hope we're going to be able to continue to export. But as it stands, you know, we've just got to get our heads down and try and improve our productivity in order to be able to withstand that sort of problem. So if you look at our price structure, it is extremely seasonal. So what you've got here, the last 2 years and this and part of this year, and the grey area is the 5-year range. So there is quite a massive range. It's seasonal, tends to be higher in the spring and the early summer, down through the summer and the autumn, and then back up through the winter. And it should be a direct reflection of production costs. But you know, you can see that it doesn't always work like that. The big drop at the beginning of this year, at the end of March, was of course COVID, when overnight our ability, you know, a lot of lamb is eaten through restaurants, through hotels, through the hospitality trade. Overnight that dropped down through nothing, and it took us a while to actually recover. Now, on the good side, I won't spend too much on this, but this is just comparing New Zealand and Australia prices with GB on the world stage. And historically, one of the reasons why New Zealand in particular, and then more latterly Australia joining the party, they've enjoyed sending lamb to us, because you can see that there's been a big difference between their farm gate price and ours. So they're selling onto a much higher value market. But that differential has all but gone recently. And so one of the things that's kept us afloat this year with the COVID problem has been that we've had fewer imports. And so it's taken some pressure off our market. And that may well be how things go in the future, and just give us a bit more leeway in terms of the French situation, certainly in the short to medium term. So we've mentioned the B word, the Brexit word, and I'm not going to go into it anymore now. So suffice to say, though, that when I'm working with my clients at the moment, it is like looking into a big black hole, because we really don't know. But all we can assume is that margins are going to get even tighter, and therefore what we need to do is to face up to some of our challenges. So if I was to sum up our challenges, and it'd be interesting actually for you to think about whether or not some are relevant and some not to yourselves. I think we've probably got 4, if I wanted to boil it down. One of them is this historical support, and just overcoming that legacy, whereby the shape, size and type of system that we operate in the UK is so hugely determined historically by subsidy, and particularly at the market end. Structural barriers, because we have this is where I come from, in the Lake District, with the Beatrix Potter Herdwick in the foreground there. Obviously, tremendous resource limitations, and the need for hardy, very relatively unproductive breeds in those areas, and competitiveness and the attractiveness of lamb in comparison to other foods. So just looking at those 4 again very quickly, I showed you this slide before, but when we had the peak in 1990, it was at that point that our farmers were actually getting, for every lowland ewe, they were getting the equivalent of a nearly £19 sterling headage payment per ewe per year. And it's not, any great surprise, therefore, that people keep a lot more ewes because they're going to get that money. And hey, they don't worry too much about the productivity because someone's paying them that money. And even worse, I dug this slide out because I was presented with an award last year for long service, probably. But I found this old slide from 1988. And prior to 1990, it was even worse because the dotted line on that slide was a guaranteed price in the European scheme. And the solid line is actually what the market price was. And our farmers were guaranteed for the scheme to make up the difference, providing they weren't absolutely grotesquely fat. So you can see again that where was the incentive at that point for us to actually get to grips with efficiency and profit margins. So it's kind of off the back of that we have our issues. And we've mentioned the hill and upland situation and the fact that we do have a massive density. The darker the area there, the bigger the density of sheep. So a lot of our sheep are kept on the hills and uplands, and looking into the future for those, of course, their future is going to be very much dependent on whether or not government is prepared to support them from an environmental and socio-economic point of view. So the hills and uplands, yeah, they will be a different situation, I think. I'm going to concentrate more on the lamb producing side of things, because I know that's what you guys are mainly interested in. But there is an interesting link. We do have what we call a stratified system, whereby we get an F1 hybrid, which is a very hardy hill ewe crossed with a very prolific long wool. In this case, these are blue-faced Leicesters. And they produce a very prolific milky F1 hybrid, which we call a mule, that is still largely the mainstay of our lowland industry in terms of finished lamb production. And that's one of these little girls on the same farm, grown up with 2 Suffolk lambs, still very much the mainstay. So that's a good way of the lowland being able to put some money back into the hills and uplands by maintaining that stratified system. Now, in terms of competitiveness, yeah, competitive against other meats. Lamb is, and I'm sure that Tom and Anita will have comments on this, but it's a small carcass, and disassembling a small carcass takes time, it takes money, and it adds cost to that. So each joint is going to be more expensive than, say, in terms of input than a bigger beef carcass. And we've also got competition from white meats, of course, but increasingly we've got competition from what we call pseudo meats and people who aren't eating meat. Although in terms of the number of people and the percentage difference that makes in the UK, we're finding it is being overplayed. They get a lot of airtime for the number of people that are actually involved, but nevertheless, it's something we need to think about. Now, my fourth one takes me towards where I want to go tonight, really, in terms of, well, how do we do this? How do we tackle trying to make these lowland flocks more profitable? And the problem basically is, and I think this will probably resonate, I hope, with you as well, is that most of our sheep farmers still don't know what their cost of production is. As I've explained, there hasn't probably been the pressure to do that. It's been much more about chasing the subsidy. Now we're going to have to know what our cost of production is if we stand a chance of making the changes that are necessary. And I will explain more about that in a minute. Generally speaking, our farmers still measure very little. What I'll talk about as we go through this today is about farmers who are still the very top of the tree. So the guys who are doing the sort of thing that I'm talking about in terms of the amount of data generation are still probably the top 5%. But what they are doing is they are enabling everyone else to work out what basic stuff they need to measure and how they may be able to use it. So it's very difficult to know what question to ask, let alone what solutions to employ, if you really do not have any decent information by way to be able to decide what your weaknesses are and then measure the impact of any solutions that you put in there. And that is absolutely critical. So just to sort of finish that little bit of an introduction off, I just love this quote by Darwin. It's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent that survives. It is the one that is most adaptable to change. And this really resonates with me because I think the UK industry has reached that point now whereby we are no longer going to be receiving subsidies in anything like a direct way. And we're going to have to adapt to that, and we're going to have to get market and cost facing if we're going to be profitable. So how do we do that without getting ourselves totally bogged down in an absolute sea of information? So what I'd like to suggest to you is, and I know that you do some cost of production stuff, Anita sent me some links and so on, so I've had a bit of a look through. I don't profess to know anything about the Canadian sheep industry, but I have done a bit of background reading, and it was very interesting. So the cost of production, if we want to be profitable, my hypothesis to you is that we have to have a margin between the price that we receive and the cost for us to produce. And I've done that in pence per kilo. I tend to work in pence per kilo carcass most of the time with my clients. Now that's really easy to say, but it's not so easy to do, because it does mean that we do actually have to start recording better our inputs and outputs. And I just want to spend the next few minutes just running through this and maybe, you know, getting you thinking about how this might apply to you. So how do we do it? Well, what I do is I break this down into three, and I'll show you an example later on, but I break it down to three key things that we need to think about. The first one, and this really does ring with the fact that I put the number of lambs reared per ewe and conception rates up there, because with any other industry, we need to have a production index. And for most of us in the lamb producing part of the sheep industry, it might be different if you got wool producing merinos in Australia, but for us, it is the amount of carcass, kilograms of carcass produced per ewe. For us, it would be per year. For those of you who have got an accelerated system, you might want to have a slightly different time scale than that, but you need a production index, and it's into that, you divide that into all of the other costs. So that's number one. Number two, we need to know about the costs involved. So we need to know about what our variable costs are, feed, vet and med, replacements, all of that sort of thing, and also what our labour, machinery and land costs are to go in. And then we need to know about our price achieved, and I'll come back to that. We'll see how time's going, but you know, obviously there are things that will impinge on that too in terms of specification and quality. So just looking at this output issue then, we've said that from a sheep producer who's producing meat point of view, we're looking at kilograms of carcass per ewe. But this is absolutely no different to if you were a wine bottling plant and the number of wine bottles you needed to get off the production line in a set period of time. Or one of my boys works for Jaguar Land Rover, and you know, his is the number of cars off the production line. Or if you're working in the National Health Service over here, then you know the KPIs are things like waiting times, number of operations done, etc. These are beginning to be more familiar to us, and in the sheep industry, you know, we're certainly encouraging farmers over here to embrace that. Lambing percentage, I have a saying about lambing percentage, you know, numbers of lambs born is vanity, numbers of lambs reared is sanity. And you know, I've got flocks where we could pregnancy scan at 230, 240% in some of these big flocks. But we know that if we do that, we're going to lose so many lambs. It's just not cost effective. So we actually positively manage the older ewes so we don't get so many triplets, etc. because what we want is this production index, not the vanity of being able to say that we scan at 230, 240%. So the sort of difference it makes, we haven't got time to go into this in any great detail, but I just thought I'd put this one up because there's our production index across the top of this one, and that is kilograms of carcass per ewe per year. So going from 25 through to 40. I would say to my guys, and again, very interesting to know how you would view this as your target, but for my lowland guys, I am looking for at least 30 if we're going to stand a chance of making any margin whatsoever. And my very highest guys are around about 40. But there are a lot of producers less than 30. So it's like good genetics, good geneticists, we've got plenty of variation. But 30 would be the sort of the baseline target. And then I've just put the fixed costs up at the left, on the left-hand side for now, ranging from what would be very low for us would be £40 per ewe up to 60, 70 would be quite normal. And given everything else is equal, you can see what a massive difference that makes in that matrix to how much it costs per kilogram of carcass, according to whether you've got a high production index or a low one, and how your fixed costs go. So the higher the fixed costs, obviously the harder we have to work in order to be able to keep that cost of production down. And equally, cutting those fixed costs arbitrarily so that we have a much reduced production index can be counterproductive. So we begin to see that we can use this index and start to interrogate, have a little bit more effect in terms of what we're actually looking at. And then we can add in things like, and I'm going to show you an example in a minute, but things like vet and med costs. I'm so pleased that you all said that you weren't looking to cut input costs, because that would not be the case if I did a similar webinar with certain demographics of our farmers anyway. When their back is against the wall, it's naturally a human instinct to cut costs. And unfortunately, usually the lowest hanging fruit are vet and med costs, and they start cutting things like clostridial vaccines, abortion vaccines. And of course, what happens is they put that production index in jeopardy. And also other things such as, obviously what we've got here is wormers and so on. Yes, we don't want to be spending too much money on them, but we can't afford arbitrary cuts. Where we do see and where we are seeing big improvements in recent times is in feed costs, and particularly the reliance and use of conserved forage. So in this particular flock, yeah, it's pretty high tech. The robot goes up and down 14, 15 times a day. But what that does is it increases our total mixed ration intake by about 20%. It means that we see no dip in intake in these ewes in the last 2 weeks before lambing, and it allows us to feed them almost entirely on forage up to lambing with just the teeniest weeniest bit of extra protein, increasingly homegrown beans, smashed up beans, and a little bit of mineral vitamin supplement as well. So we're able to really cut the costs and get massive performance. A flock not very far away from that, not very far away from me now. This is what these ladies will be eating now. So these are wilted sugar beet tops. They don't come inside. They will stay outside. Very cheap feed. But there's two guys there. You can hardly see the boss behind Nick in front. But there's two guys there, and so the labour input is quite high. And that's a slightly different way of looking at it. Low feed costs, but the labour costs are going to be that much higher. So variable cost is the other one, and then I mentioned price, and really just to mention it in passing, because a lot of our farmers, when I talk about this, say, oh, we've got no influence on price, it's what the buyers will pay. Well, but when you dig into it, of course, there's a massive difference in terms of hitting the spec, which is the carcass on the left-hand side, would be a spec that our farmers would be encouraged to try and meet. 19.5 kilo carcass, average conformation, and a 3L fatness. Whereas on the right hand side is a big fat thing, much bigger carcass. I think you have a much better market for bigger carcasses than we do. Our guys would get hammered for this, and they probably wouldn't get paid for 4.5 kilos of the one on the right because it's outside of specification. So a lot of them are producing kilos of carcass that they don't realise they're not actually getting paid for. And that, of course, is going to reduce the overall price. And as we'll see in a minute, just little changes can make a big difference to the bottom line. So what we're trying to do then, and I'm conscious that we're covering quite a lot of ground now. I think it's being recorded, so maybe if I'm going too fast, then you can listen again. But so what I do is I've got an example farm here. So this is what my unit cost of production spreadsheet would look like. I haven't got a live one now. We probably haven't got time, but I could find a live one later. So I start off by working out how many cars are coming off the end of the production line. So what's the lambing index? And in this case, it's only 1.4. If you look at our national averages, they are somewhere in the region, not much better than that. Some years we might get to 1.55 sometimes as a national average. My best flocks, I'll show you one later on, we did 1.84 this year. So again, massive variation. 19 kilo carcass. So we're producing 26.6 kilos of carcass per ewe per year, quite a way off my target of 30. And then we know what the other costs are, and we've put those in, and the spreadsheet calculates those then on the basis of pence per kilo. And what that means is that if we change any of those, then we change that calculation. And we're now looking at being able to say what our costs for each of those is. And one of the biggest you'll see is actually replacements. For ewes and rams, if you add those up, that's as big as the forage cost in this particular example. Then we've got, one of the beauties of this as well is that I teased out what the lamb costs are. Obviously, for that if they're static, then that means that you're not sort of messing all of this up. Your ewe costs are standard, and then you're just adding this in for every lamb that is reared. So we pull those out separately, and again do it on a pence per kilo. And then I've put in the total fixed cost for you, and in this example it's just under £50, £49.50. And we end up here with a break-even cost of 424 pence per kilo. You can add back a bit of wool, break-even 411, and then if we put an assumed market price of 385 in, you can see that this guy is losing £7 per ewe. So you look at that and think, well, where on earth do we start? And I would always suggest, and when we get a little bit further on, we'll do a little bit more in detail on this, but where I would always look is here to start with, because that's low. We need to try and get that up. And so I would be looking to see why it's only 1.4. Is it empty ewes? Is it lamb losses? Is it an abortion problem? What is it? Because there's something in there that we need to address. And if we do address that, and we can increase it to 1.6 and 19.2 kilos, and what I've done on this here is I've actually increased the vet and med a little bit, and I have also increased the lamb feed a little bit, and I have, if I remember rightly, I've put an extra little bit, 10 pence a kilo on here, because we've done a better job and more lambs in spec. Small changes, but what we've got now is we've got this up to this 30.7, and you can see that we have now gone to a profit of 10.99. Nothing revolutionary, nothing major to the system, which is what a lot of people tend to do. They think, oh, well, this system's not making me money, I've got to bin it and do what Joe down the road is doing. What we've done is taken a stand back and say, right, okay, we can improve this rearing percentage, found the weaknesses and put them right. And we've actually increased the bottom line by, more like 18 or 19 pounds a ewe if you go from -7 up to plus 10.99. And the beauty of this approach, of course, is that we can make changes, we can spend a bit more money, increase the cost per ewe, but if our kilograms of carcass are going up, then we can work out what the benefit and the balance is. So that's the basic premise of looking at cost of production. But how, in reality, do we bring that down to what's really going to matter? So, where do we start? No one wants to be recording any information that isn't going to be useful to them. History is littered with this, and particularly with EID, which we'll come on to. You can record tens of thousands of bits of information, but if they're not useful, then you're not going to use them. And I'll be absolutely honest, we are still struggling with the software solutions in order to be able to do some of the things I'm going to talk about. But we do it, but we haven't got actually on-the-shelf software that will do all of it. So what have you got? What improvements? What are the additional costs going to be? And what additional information do I actually need, rather than diving in and recording absolutely everything? And what I'm going to suggest to you is, as again, a hypothesis for you to think about, and how I view this with my own farmers and the farmer little groups that I work with, is we wage war on wastage. Because for most sheep flocks, in my experience, certainly, it is those wastage factors, and in two particularly, the ones we've got in front of us here, are the number of unproductive ewes. We'll have a look at what we mean at that in a minute, and underperforming lambs. I mean, these two are a particularly grotty pair of examples, aren't they? But lambs, they're not dead, they're alive, they're not sick, but they are pretty grim. And they are not going to make good carcasses, they are not going to make the best prices, and they're not growing very well, so they're not very efficient. So those are my two areas, and we're going to go and have a little wander into that now. So our unproductive ewes, and this is basically ewes that fail to rear, okay, for whatever reason. And so our recording there, this is where EID begins to be quite important, because there is no excuse for us not being able to record a ewe that fails to at least produce. Never mind selection for breeding and the ewes that produce the most lamb, of course that's important. But now we're talking about the basic profitability of a commercial flock. So it might be that they're empty. And I think this is an interesting, I find it quite interesting that obviously we use ultrasound scanning a lot. And I know that I read in the research that Ontario sheep producers have been doing, you've been sponsoring some work using blood tests, which is really interesting. But empty ewes are a real drag on things. And for my guys, if you ask our sheep farmers, they will say, oh, well, we expect maybe 4 or 5% of our ewes to be empty when we actually pregnancy scan halfway through pregnancy, which is ridiculous, because if we're doing our job properly, that should be 1% or less. That's our target. There is no excuse for it being any higher in a once-a-year production system. Clearly in your star systems, that would be a slightly different thing. They may have aborted, be it toxoplasmosis, enzootic, we get Campylobacter, Salmonella, you name it, but abortion is another one that we can do things about. It may be weak lambs, poor milk, lamb losses, they failed to rear because the lambs actually didn't make it. We can have prolapses and dystocia at the other end of the scale if they're far too fat. Lameness is another one. If you look at some work that was done here about 15 years ago, the difference in the number of empty ewes in a flock where lameness wasn't being controlled as opposed to the other half of the flock where it was, it makes a huge difference. Metabolic disease, again, coming back to nutrition. Losses post-turnout. I understand, obviously, that some of you will have great problems with predation and coyotes. And right at the bottom, but by no means the least, are poor records and culling policy. Because if we don't keep those records, if we don't use the ability that we now have with electronic identification and at least logging what that ewe did, if she smiles sweetly at you when she comes through the race pre-topping the following year and you haven't done something about making sure you know she's got to go, she's likely to come around again. And some of our really big commercial flocks, 2,000-4,000 ewes, if they don't watch it, they can have a whole cohort of 100, 200 ewes who are just having a really nice party and not doing very much at all. So lots of reasons for unproductive ewes. Now, we'll come back to that in a minute. Optimising lamb growth rate. why is this so important? And it is really important. And I think as an industry, we certainly over here, we don't pay enough credence to this, because generally speaking, as you saw from our prices rise as the winter goes on. And so our farmers think, oh, well, it doesn't really matter, they're going to be worth more in 2 or 3 months' time. But what they don't realise is that lambs are at their most efficient when they're growing fast. A lamb that grows at 100 grams a day will require twice as much energy to reach the same weight as a lamb growing at 300 grams a day. Fact of life. So efficiency is really important if we're going to max out and optimize our use of resources and keep our costs under control. So look, all sorts of things are going to affect lamb performance, and we haven't obviously got time to go into all of these tonight. But the one that's missing there, and the one that I do just want to spend a little bit of time on, is ewe nutrition and body condition score. Because this is the area where I've certainly been doing a lot of work in recent years. And you know, you might say, oh gosh, that's not very high tech. Body condition scoring isn't high tech, but we'll come on to that. We're trying to get it into the technological world. But that is an area where we've been able to prove that the effect on lamb performance is far greater and far longer term than we had always expected it to be. So we've known for quite a long while that energy restriction before a lamb is about 30% mature is going to affect its lifetime potential. So things like the liver and the intestine are reduced in size. So obviously they're going to limit how much nutrition they can actually turn into growth. And the capacity of the muscles themselves are also going to be limited. And we've known that for quite a while. But what we couldn't do until we got this wonderful capability, which is, I've put in a cartoon here, but it is this wonderful ability that it is a yellow tag on the left-hand side, being able to put an EID tag into a lamb and be able to monitor lots of lambs over the whole of their lifetime to slaughter, means that we can really start to get to grips with what is happening and what factors are really impinging on lamb growth rate. And it's really, I suppose, this last 5 or 6 years, I've waited over 30 years to be able to do this. But what we can now do is, instead of just looking at group averages, we can follow individual animals and we can analyse this data in a much, much more robust way. And of course, you know, we are some of the top guys, we will use this sort of kit. So this is a 3-way draft, but we've actually got a 6-way draft now. But you know, we have got all singing, all dancing stuff. But what I'm using this for now is not to say to my farmers, you've all got to have this, of course not. But we have been doing a lot of work boiling it back down so that farmers who haven't got access to this can actually use it to make a difference. So instead, and we can also, instead of just looking at the individual lamb, we can take that lamb back to its mother and we can have a look at the factors to do with that, its mother, and in particular body condition score, and the effect that that has on the performance of her lambs. And that goes all the way back to our production index, and so we go back to where we want to be, which is making a difference. So what we have found, because now what we can do is we can monitor and we can weigh lambs really easily, and by putting them through the auto system, we can come up with the graphs like this. So on the right hand side, what we've got, H little cross is a weight event. This is a flock of, it's about, I'm just trying to think, that's about 1,800 lambs in total there. And you can see there's coloured straight lines, which are our weight targets. The green one would be about 300 grams a day. And what we found is that if we do this and we look at 8-week weights in particular, so 0.2 on that right-hand graph, and then wheel over to the left-hand side of this slide, our target, if we're going to do 300 grams a day, is to reach the 20 kilos as an 8-week weight for these lambs, and that includes birth weight. So we've been doing that and looking at the spread, And of course, that's great. The average for that is over 20. So if you're just looking at averages, you would think, well, that's okay. But of course, it isn't okay, because what we've got is we've got a cohort of animals down here that are not reaching 20 kilos. And this is where my wastage factor comes in, because those guys are the ones that are letting the side down. They are not growing fast enough. And if we look at this and we take it to further when they're 12 to 14 weeks of age, what we have found is that almost without exception, if you are down in that bottom end at 8 weeks, you are going to be down at the bottom end all of your life. And you are going to be the ones that cost all the money, have to feed them to get them finished, poor carcass quality and poor carcass weights, etc. So one of the things that we've done, and I should say these are adjusted 8-week weights because we have birth dates, they're actually adjusted for 56 days. What we've actually been able to do is to be able to say, well, that is a key performance indicator on its own. If the percentage of lambs that are failing to reach our target at 8 weeks is a key KPI, because that is really measuring the sort of wastage, and we need to be able to do something to be able to reduce that number. So what we were also doing at the same time was looking at body condition score in ewes in a way that I've body condition scored for many, many years. In fact, the arthritis in my right hand knows so bad it hurts when I do it. But for years we've done it, and for years we have given ewes targets at certain points in the production cycle. But what we've never been able to do when we've been looking at the body condition scores is to be able to look at the effect of body condition score change between points or the longer term effects of body condition score. It's really been, for example, you will all be familiar, I'm sure, with having to reach a certain body condition score in the period before they go to the ram, before joining mating. And we're very used to the fact that that has an influence. But what we've been able to do now is to show that actually, in terms of productivity of these ewes, that matters. But what matters equally as much is whether or not that ewe then continues to at least hold, if not gain more condition, up to the point where we actually pregnancy scan them. And if you don't get that right, it doesn't matter what we do or what condition she's in, be it very, very good at lambing, we are still not going to get the best 8-week weights. So we've been able to look at this longer term longitudinal effect. So whilst you will be expecting to see something like this, which is as the ewe body condition score at lambing increases, so does the lamb weight at 8 weeks. And on this particular bit, we were able to show that a unit of body condition score at lambing was worth 5.4 kilos per lamb weaned. So this goes on to when they're actually weaned, and this is for 2 lambs. So we could quantify it. But what we actually found when we started to look at this more carefully and to really examine these guys down here at the bottom was we found that, yes, we've got all of these effects that we would expect of body condition score. But if we went to weaning and this recovery of body condition score, the effect of whether or not we were successful here and whether or not we were able to maintain that through to the mid-pregnancy period has a massive and unequivocal effect on milk yield and how well her lambs do to 8 weeks. So what this was really beginning to do was, if we want to, if I just go back to the previous slide, oh no, it's going to go back too far, never mind. But if we actually look at that and work out the body condition score, what we really got to was the fact that being able to keep using the right body condition and not let them fall outside the range, not let them get very thin in this period during milk yield, was actually having a massive effect right over the piece in terms of how well the ewes performed and also how well the lambs performed the following year. And and their growth performance. The other thing that we found by concentrating on Ewes body condition score is that if you do that as a management tool, you become intolerant of all sorts of other issues that result in unproductive use and wastage. So if they're outside of that, so for example, it might be in this case, this particular flock I've just put there in the middle, we had a problem with Ewes. It might be Mydivisna, it might be OPA, it might be, this is an awful photograph there, but in this case it was actually a flock with problems with Haemonchosis, and we increasingly find that it's an individual animal problem. If you're using body condition score as your overriding key performance indicator, your overriding target, then everything else and the priority of everything else falls into place, and you can really drive things from that towards where you want to be. You know, things like, for example, Mydivisna. If we've got a flock, what most of my flocks do now is we actually will blood test the oldest, leanest ewes in the flock when we get post-weaning, because we know that if we're going to find Mydivisna, then there's every chance, if it's there, it will be in these older, leaner ewes. But by using body condition scoring, they drop out on their own. And to the point where I've got one big flock of 4,500 ewes, and unfortunately we got Mydivisna into it, and we're trying to deal with it. But actually now, at any point in the production cycle, if a ewe, no matter what age she is, falls outside of the target for body condition score, she's automatically culled, she's gone. And by doing that, we've been able to reduce the incidence quite dramatically. And also something else which is happening, poor dentition. And everyone's familiar with the fact that obviously a set of incisors like that is not going to be the best thing in the world to be eating forage with. But one of the things I'm currently trying to get some funding to look at is cheek teeth. And this was a little bit of work a colleague of mine did in an abattoir about 18 months ago. And, you know, we are finding now that when we get a cohort of these ewes, this was 20 odd ewes, very young ewes in a flock. We did all of their teeth. Of the 22, 18 of them had molars that were shot to pieces like this and didn't stand a chance. So again, it's pointing us in the right direction of where the wastage is and where we need to direct our efforts. So body condition scoring, can we bring it up into the 21st century? We're trying. So obviously palpating and doing the scoring by hand is absolutely fine. And this is one of the beauties of it. We do not need the technology. But what we are doing now, just to prove I do the job now and again, but what we are trying to do is, with the massive data sets that we've generated from a research point of view, is to see if we can actually develop an algorithm which allows us to use weight to body condition score. Now, we know that that will be an individual animal thing because of the variation, but the hypothesis is that if we can log the weight of a ewe at body condition score 3 at the start of the season, then we can actually use her weight changes over the year to use an autodraft facility to actually condition score her. So we are trying to apply the technology to the old technology, if you like. The thing that we've got to be really wary of with all of this is that we are focused, as I said right at the beginning, in terms of what it is we're trying to achieve. Information is only a means to an end. And what you're looking at there is actually a graph for one of my flocks from this year. This is straight out of the software that we use, Farm IT 3000. And this is a flock with about 2,800 lambs in it, very high performing, 1.84 reared this year. But I thought it was just worth saying, you know, if you're not careful, you can get really lost and drown in all of this. But I thought I'd just put up with you one of the ways that we use this information for this flock. These are 8-week weights again. On the left-hand side there, actually, that should have, oops, sorry, that should have been an animation, excuse me, sorry about that. So here what we've got are the actual overall 8-week weights. So they're lined up, so there's 20. You can see that this flock really does excel. It's creep fed, it's high input, high output, so we would expect that. On the right hand side though, the shepherd and I have a massive debate about this. We've got lambs that were side by Beltexes, which basically grow slowly, as opposed to Texels, which grow a lot faster. And you can see the difference between those two is massive. So I have to make sure that because the Beltexes are a lot slower, they're going to eat more creep, but they do make a lot more per head in the market, and we just have to balance that off. But one of the other things, just to give an example here, is just to check that our nutrition is right, that we're not having this big wastage factor. He does rear triplets in this case. We're looking at what the triplets are doing. And again, you can see the triplets, obviously, it's a slightly lower average, and there are more lambs below 20. But equally, I think we can be pretty proud of the fact that these ewes are rearing triplets and they're still doing pretty well. We just need to watch this bottom end. So we use it really actively to look at what's happening. So just to finish off then, we've had a bit of a gamble through all of this, but what I really wanted to try and to sort of say to you is that, look, you know, there is a way through this. If we can use our cost of production, if we can bear to actually record our input costs, take a really good stab at what our overhead costs are, so we can get to an honest cost of production. And then we put in it something like the spreadsheet that I showed you. We can actually really do a what if, and we can really look at squeezing what's already there and covering off the weaknesses. So we need to measure current performance and be really honest about it. And in doing that, we can identify the main weaknesses and prioritize them. So it might be, for example, I've put an ultrasound scanner up there, partly because I thought it might engender some discussion, but you know, for some of mine, if it's a low scanning percentage, then I've got to address that first and foremost and find out what is going on and prioritize that, and then measure how well we're doing. So we find the technical solutions, and we've discussed body condition score may well be, in a lot of cases, the go-to first technical solution that I would try to put right. It might be nutrition, of course. It could be all sorts of things. But then we have to measure the impact and start all over again, looking for the next weakness and putting it right and measuring the impact rather than any knee-jerk reactions. And it's that sort of process that we really do need to try and get into that sort of circle. And then we can do this sort of thing. You know, you're there, 1.4, let's say that was a scanning problem, it was a fertility problem. We try and put that right. We might have to spend a little bit more, but we get up there, we improve our carcass a little bit because of lamb health and not having this wastage, and then we end up with being able to make those sorts of differences and being able to measure it before we start doing something else. So, in summary, go back to the beginning. Our industry is facing some serious challenges, and we really don't know what the size of the cliff is, but there's a bit of a cliff, even if it's not a complete dead end. Knowledge of cost of production is going to be essential. Those people who are going to survive and are going to stay with you know, a profitable flock are going to have to know what their cost of production is. I think wastage is a major target for all of us, and I think that we now have, and that is where we need to first and foremost focus our data and information requirements. And EID really offers us a means to generate a lot of that information. We're still distilling it. We still need to distill it further down to what we think is really important for you guys to measure and how to do it, and not to get bogged down in it. And I'd like to suggest to you that as a single most influential key performance indicator, the body condition score of your ewes at all times, and not allowing them to fall outside of a reasonable range, is probably the one most important thing that certainly we've found by using all of this high-tech technology. Okay, thank you very much, Tom. I will.
Perfect. Thank you, Lesley. And Anita and I will now start taking a quick peek at the questions in the question box. But thank you very much for your presentation. I'm just going to turn screen share back over to perfect. That should be back over, and I'm not seeing any questions at the moment. So just for those who are listening, feel free to type your questions if you have any into the question box, and Anita and I will keep an eye on those coming through.
Is it worth just putting those polls back up, Tom, just at the moment, just so we can?
So let me just go back to the first one.
Okay, so we had number of lambs reared per ewe, and obviously higher profit margin. So I think I'd be interested to know how the cost of production issue resonates with people in terms of profit margin per kilo. I mean, what sort of amount would you be using for fixed costs in an Ontario flocks?
Anita, are you on the?
Yeah, so we, Lesley, as I had mentioned in my notes to you, very few of our lambs are sold on a carcass weight basis.
Yeah.
So I think for the majority of producers, they would be looking at perhaps total lamb weight, live weight sold per ewe versus the carcass.
Yeah.
and I don't think we're too far off. We use what's called the contribution margin. So basically just looking at production costs or variable costs, if we want to look at it that way, subtracted from our sales. And we're wanting producers to be targeting between a 20 and a 30% contribution margin, so that they can pay themselves a wage and that they can also pay their interest in their land payments, et cetera, right?
Yeah.
And in a survey that was done, fairly in-depth one, a number of years ago now, 2010, 11, and 12, our top producers are achieving that. Same as everywhere, there's quite a lot of variability between like a range in the variability between low-end producers and top-end producers, regardless of production system.
Right. Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any problem. You can use live weight as opposed to carcass weight. It's just a slightly different number, isn't it? It's interesting that higher growth rate was not so much on the agenda. I mean, is that because people are achieving really high growth rates, or?
Yeah, I'm not sure. My own take on it is they're not achieving the higher growth. Like, there's still lots of room for improvement on growth rates, because our days to market is always something we're trying to push, get lower and lower. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the efficient, and the other thing about that as well is that certainly what I find is that where you have got flocks where we've got lower growth rates, and obviously a lot of these lambs that are falling below the KPI at 8 weeks, so they're going to be around much later. The knock-on effect is on the ewes, so it all fits in with the body condition score thing, because having too many lambs around that are going to compete with your ewes later on in the season means that your ability to be able to keep the body condition score where you want it is limited. And so it becomes a double-edged sword, really. So the two things are really linked on a lot of farms.
Yep.
And the other point that might just, I didn't know where I emphasized this very much, but one of the things that we found was that for many, many years, and I was certainly brought up to believe this, we were told that once a ewe was actually in lamb and she was past that implantation stage in early pregnancy, that in that mid-trimester, actually it didn't matter whether she lost a little bit of body condition.
Yes.
And actually the work that we have done with all of this, the one thing, and in fact, I wish I could share more with you, but it's just about to be published as a PhD. And once Neris has done that, then we'll be able to go to town on it. But it's loud and clear is that that is not correct. If you follow that through to the performance of lambs at 8 weeks and the combined 8-week weight and weaning weight of those ewes, the ewes that do the best every time statistically significantly are the ones that certainly maintain and preferably continue to gain a little weight. It might not be condition, because obviously condition is not quite so sensitive, but certainly are on the upward slant rather than downwards. And that has really bust that one completely out of the water.
Yes, for sure. So we have one question from our participants, Lesley, and it's what's the best initial investment of technology for a new growing producer to maximize bang for the buck or maximize return on investment?
In terms of EID technology,
I'm assuming yes.
Yeah, I mean, my advice would always be, and interestingly enough, I've just had this debate with one of my clients today. I'm a firm believer that with EID, you start at the bottom and you build it like a Lego kit. So, I mean, and I can't remember what the situation in Canada is, but obviously all of our animals have to be EID now. We have to do that from a point of view of traceability. So every animal has to have a little yellow RFID tag in it. And so the very base of that would be, and where I'm starting with this client is that we will start with a good stick reader, a stick reader that's linked to some software that will allow us in the first instance to record everything that we need to record to be legally compliant, and also will begin to allow us to start recording some individual ewe data, not that we're breeding from them, but in order to be able to make sure that we're not keeping these passengers, if they commit a certain sin, they're out without any doubt at all. So a stick reader, a little bit of software, that software is going to cost us, I think, £200. It Bluetooths from the stick reader straight to an Android or iOS phone. And you can have as many devices as you want, so you haven't got any special computing power or anything like that. Just put it on a tablet and that will get you started. And from there, when you want to, you can go to a little thing that you can put on your weigh scales, put some load bars in, and again that will Bluetooth across, and then you start getting up into the sort of stuff that was on my slides. But the very basic, a stick reader and the sort of software package that we can use, that you can use on your phone or a tablet. And cost of that, our stick readers, the one I'm buying is about £550, and the software is £200. So £750 total investment to get started.
Yeah, and that would be similar here when we translate that over into Canadian dollars.
Okay.
Our stick readers are probably a little bit more expensive, and maybe that's because we have the companies have a captive audience. I'm not sure, but you're probably looking at 1,500 Canadian dollars for a run-of-the-mill stick reader.
Yeah,
and there are. Yeah, and there are some software, sheep-specific software programs that would be in the $300 to $500 range.
Yeah. Okay. So a bit more than us. I think there's probably, if you look at the stick breeders and so on and stuff on the market over here, I think they all match each other to some extent. But obviously, you know, you need to make sure your stick reader is actually one that will talk to the software. So we're actually selling the old one. So the one they're currently using is a Shearwell one. And unfortunately, the Shearwell software here doesn't do what we particularly want to do. So we'll sell that on second hand. It's got a value, and put the other software in.
Right. So there's no other questions, but there was one when you were talking about identifying wastage and managing wastage to improve profitability. With our flocks and some producers being on accelerated systems, a ewe that doesn't breed in say this breeding is often allowed into, you know, so she's pregnancy scanned, she's open, she's allowed to move into the next breeding group. And the risk always is it's easy to lose track of those ewes that are taking an easy ride through the system. Is there any again, you know, obviously EID would help with that, but is there any other pointers you can give producers in terms of tracking or identifying those animals that are particularly in the ewe flock that are not contributing to the overall profitability?
Yeah, I mean, like, as you say, Anita, I think EID is the trick that will give you what you need, because you know you can log that through. The challenge will be having the software that can do that for you without you having to rip it back to Excel and mess about with it. But this was always the issue with the three times in 2 years breeding that you know we had flocks over here doing. It was the ewes that slipped from one to the other, and I think, you know, you've got to have your expectations. So my attitude to this would be that I would have my expectation as, what does a ewe, turn it around the other way and look at the cost of production. What does a ewe have to produce on, let's say, a rolling annual basis? What's that production index need to be to leave you the profit margin at the bottom, and to turn it around that way? And if there are ewes there that are not achieving that, then they're the ones that are letting the side down.
Okay.
You know, I think it's easy for us to kid ourselves because we think, well, you know, she's expensive and we've got to keep her going. But if on a rolling basis, if you're expecting 3 lambings in 2 years and she's done 2 lambings in 2 years, and neither has she been particularly prolific at that point, if you can do a production index on these ewes, then they will show themselves up really quickly.
Right. I was wondering if, I mean, you're promoting body condition scoring and how important it is to keep the flock productive and the impact it has on lamb growth as well. If we look at the extreme end, so those obese ewes, like, could we be using body condition score to identify those ewes that have skipped 1 or 2 or 3 lambings, right? Or breedings, I should say.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, certainly with all the work that we've done in the last few years, I'm a little more relaxed than I used to be about ewes that are slightly over condition. But equally, you know, when you start to look at the other end, being over condition is obviously going to kick us into other problems. But yes, I mean, so whilst I was saying, we can pick out all of these problems by the ewes that are below the condition score that we would want, you're right. At the other end of the scale, the ones that are over the top would be the ones that haven't been working very hard, wouldn't they? Or haven't been doing anything. So you know, you could use it at either end of the scale.
Okay, we have a fairly quiet group here today because I don't see any other questions, and I don't see anyone with their hand raised in the chat box.
Nope, nor do I, Anita. So that being said, maybe I can make a few closing remarks and just highlight next week's speaker, and then we'll just see if any questions come through in the meantime. But thank you, Lesley, for your presentation and joining us today with the knowledge you bring. And also, just a reminder to everyone that next week, November 26th at 12 noon is our last Fall Speakers Series with Neil Sargentson. So details for that are on the events page for Ontario Sheep, or if you scroll through the Twitter feed, you'll certainly find the link to register as you did for this event today. And that being said, I'm just going to peek in here one more time and see if there's any other questions. And I see nothing in the chat box or in the questions panel. So I think you're off the hook, Lesley.
Oh, it sounds like it. I'm probably completely ear bashed.
Well, thank you very much. I know I speak for all of Ontario Sheep when I say thank you for joining us. But
oh, thank you for having me. It's been really good. It's a shame I can't see people and get a trip to Canada, you know. But maybe sometime I'd love to come back to Canada again.
We'll certainly keep that in mind. And also just to remind everyone that hopefully by the end of the week we will have the recording posted on our webinar library. So feel free to check in there to watch again or share with anyone who missed today's session. All right, well, thank you. And I'm going to log us out of here now.
Okay.
Thanks so much.
Leslie.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.